welcome everybody to this imedu webinar, the third one actually, and the first one with an official guest. So I'm very happy and proud that Craig is willing to join us here. When I started with virtual education or working with 3D Worlds, actually the first person I found on LinkedIn that was actually already posting about it, and it was long before Mark Zuckerberg mentioned the metaverse, was Craig, and he was already telling about giving classes in VR and telling his learnings. So I thought it would be a great opportunity for him to invite, for us to invite him here to this webinar. And well, we are usually talking about the tool and how you make classes. Craig is actually an instructional designer, so I thought it would be great if he could share some thoughts with us on that subject. So welcome, Craig, and maybe you can give a short introduction about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, one of the things, I guess, that made me interested in this medium in the first place is my work with students. I have tons of stories, either face-to-face or through other teachers with my podcast called VR in Education, about the reaction that students often have when we take them into a virtual world. You know, I'll unpack more of that, but I think ultimately colleges, universities, and then K-12, I think the landscape is shifting towards greater emphasis to engage our students in their learning, and immersive 3D virtual worlds can do that for us.
Yeah, exactly. And how did you start with working with virtual worlds? What was your first encounter?
Yeah, my origin story was with my son. He was 16 at the time, and we were walking through a mall in Canada because it was really cold outside. So that's what you do in Canada in the winter. And we stopped by a store that was displaying a HTC Vive, and you could sign up and you could try some of the immersive experiences. And my son tried it, and he was just blown away, and he convinced me to put the headset on. And when I finally did, that's when the wheels were turning, because it was so convincing to me. The experience that I did was something that Valve had designed. It was called The Lab, and I decided to pick a place called Vespers Peak, and I went on to the side of this mountain called Vespers Peak. But it gave me goosebumps. I had a little puppy dog followed you around, so you had a little companion. You could pet the dog, you could explore around, and it was, putting me in this field trip. I'm scared of heights, and I was, okay with this experience, and so I just was blown away at the possibilities.
Yes, and is that context thing then, that environment, is that the thing you think that virtual reality is adding to in this case an experience, or maybe also a learning experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think of I call them the big three. The big three is, what makes these virtual worlds so amazing for learning, and unequivocally, number one is it provides context. There's a great book called Learning in 3D by Dr. Carl Kapp, and in his book, a marvelous quote where he says, if we sometimes say content is king, well, in a 3D immersive world, then the environment is the kingdom. And that is so true, because when we teach students, often it's out of context. It's in a classroom. We sometimes use lecture slides. And so it's hard for our brains to really make a connection that is long lasting to what we're teaching them. But if we plop them in a world that is related to what we're trying to teach them, then cognitive science or brain science would tell you that you're more likely to store this in long-term memory. We all can think back to some of our memories, and there's something fantastic that probably happened to trigger that memory. Like, my dad remembers when Elvis died and where he was and so on. And so having the right context for students, even if it's only just a 5-minute experience, is so powerful to make the learning sticky, memorable, and then emotional. When we get kids emotionally attached to their learning, they are excited, they are engaged, and they're more motivated to do more about it. And so creating a virtual world that does that has been, for me, one of the most important things, and one of the reasons why I gravitate to designing virtual worlds for myself at the school I'm at now, as well as other teachers.
So does it also mean then that we can learn facts in virtual worlds, or
Yeah, I mean, if we think about, we can't learn deeply about nothing. So, I'm not saying, and I often say this to other teachers, that we need to throw the facts out. Facts are still important, but it's basically, once we've taken some time to give them a basic set of content knowledge, let's get them to apply it to a bigger situation, get them to have perspective. Maybe I've designed virtual worlds where it's a before world, where maybe it's an underwater ecosystem and they see various food chains that are happening. So they see maybe some algae, they see some plants that are eating that on that algae, so they're exploring that. So that's the before. And then I create a second room that's actually linked to that, where something happens, a disaster, like an oil spill has all of a sudden sort of populated that world. And I call this, we have the ability, almost like a time machine, to change time, and we can fast forward them to this sort of catastrophic event that's happened to that virtual environment. And they have to explore around and think about and ruminate, what has changed here? We're in a new sort of situation. We've seen this disaster, explore around and try and figure out, how has this virtual environment now changed as a consequence of the disaster? In this case, maybe an oil spill. Or, imedu has these environments called the farm. So you could do the opposite, where you could change the farm so that, like, a tornado hit it. So they're walking around, maybe they make observations in the after. The tornadoes hit it, what's still standing? What do they notice that is still part of this tornado hit virtual farm? And then go to the before. So go back in time and have them look at, what did the farmer have in place that enabled some of the structures or some of the animals still to be around as a consequence of this tornado hitting. So again, getting kids not just to walk around, but to walk around with purpose and thinking about it, and deeper learning, go way beyond the facts. So step one might be, okay, what is on the farm? But step two is, what if something, we talk about transfer. It's hard for kids to transfer knowledge. They might be able to memorize knowledge, but can we get them to problem solve or transfer that knowledge to a new situation? And again, it's so quick and easy with no code virtual worlds like what imedu has. I find it easy to generate a new world, that's not going to take me hours and hours and hours of prep time. And yet kids can think so much more deeply than about what did happen. Why did it happen? So lots for them to sink their teeth in, not so much if they're in the classroom working on a worksheet, where worksheets are fill in the blank, they're low level thinking.
Yeah, interesting. I like what you say, like walking around with a purpose, I think, because that's a lot of feedback that we get. And sometimes that people think, hey, my students are going to walk around, they're just going to explore. But if you can tell them, well, they have a purpose, it's actually the intention that they walk around. They need to explore and make connections on their own. I think that's the essence. And if you make if you make a room, it should be part of that design, that there's something, even if you that there's a challenge for them, like a sort of a quest maybe to do. But how would you say these classes fit into a regular curriculum? Because you're not going to do all your education, right, in virtual reality. So how would you fit this into a regular course, and how would you design for it, maybe, or how would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at how we deliver our classes and courses, we're taught in the School of Education around the world, we're taught that students should be exposed to a variety of different teaching modalities and teaching strategies. So, this means that it is okay to every once in a while throw a lecture their way, as long as it's not too long. It's okay to show them some video instruction. It's okay to expose them to maybe games, but this is another tool in our tool belt where we have this this differentiated way of instructing kids according to the content, where now we have virtual worlds that we can use, and we can expose them to yet another perspective on whatever topic we're studying. And usually those aren't, as we already talked about, those aren't necessarily the low level facts. We might start out with key vocabulary. We might start out with sort of painting a picture for them so that they have something to chew on. But then the virtual worlds become a way to connect those to what we call schema or concepts. So bigger ideas. I just designed a world for the grade 3s here at my school where they're exploring their culture where they live here. But one way to get them to really understand deep about the culture here in Vancouver, Canada, is to expose them to maybe other cultures so that they can compare and contrast. So I worked with the teachers and we designed a 3D virtual world about Inuit culture, which is up in the Canadian Arctic. And, the world contained a number of different artifacts or 3D assets, and the students had to go in. I numbered them. So a number of these, one was a skidoo, one was a sled dog with a sled. Another thing I numbered in the environment was some different kinds of organisms that they might see up in the Arctic. So they explored around, they saw the numbers, and they got out of that experience, and they had a Google Doc and they had to fill in what were some of these numbered things. And then we asked them, are these part of the Inuits culture, which are needs or wants? We also asked them, can cultures have categories of things like, entertainment is a category within our cultural world. Transportation might be a category that defines a culture. And so we got them to think about some of the things they saw, how did they link to those categories? And then ultimately, finally, we said, what were some similarities between Vancouver, Canada culture and Inuit culture, as well as what were some differences between the culture that you saw in that 3D virtual world for the Inuit compared to the culture that you're studying right now, which is, Vancouver culture.
Yes, yeah, interesting. So it's not like that you say that you're picking like this course is suitable for VR, but it's more like, okay, how can I enrich my specific class or course with another perspective? And that's I think what you say, that's the power of virtual reality in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, and lots of curriculums are starting to have these deeper, we call them conceptual understandings. So these aren't facts like, how many planets in our solar system, that's a fact. Or how many parts to the heart, that's a fact. Or when did World War II end, that's a fact. Virtual reality's superpowers or virtual worlds superpowers aren't necessarily to expose them to those facts. It's to concepts. So change or development or systems thinking. How can we use virtual worlds to get them to think about these bigger ideas? Identity, cultural identity, for example, was one of the big concepts in the unit that these grade 3s had to understand. And how does that compare or contrast to others? So conceptual understanding is how we usually connect virtual worlds to curriculum. And if it's a strong curriculum, there are bigger concepts sort of inside when you unpack that curriculum that kids need to know.
Yeah. Maybe you see me glancing sideways once in a while because that's I'm keeping an eye on the chat and there are some questions. Let me see. There's one question of somebody who says, Craig, did you use Blender or Unity or WebXR for building your space? I think it was about the Inuit space.
Yeah, I used imedu. So, again,
that's WebXR.
Not paying me.
Yeah.
Sorry, WebXR.
Yeah.
So I'm not being paid to promote the product here. I'm just an instructional
Okay.
designer. I have used others, but something that's no code. Again, WebXR, where you can just send a link out to the kids and they can enter it that way. These kids are on iPads, so they're exploring this Inuit culture on an iPad. So they don't need sort of expensive, high-powered computers, nor do they have to download things. So very much beneficial for schools that don't have big budgets.
Mhm.
You could look at them in VR headsets. That's a possibility, but we don't, or we didn't for this example of the Inuit culture. We have 8 headsets at the school. We try and limit them to grade 4 and up. And this was a grade 3 project.
Okay. Clear. Yeah. Maybe it's also a good moment then to dive a bit into designing. So, let's say you design a course. How would you? I mean, I think it's different from designing a regular course in class, right? Because as you say, it's a whole different environment with avatars. People can run around. It's not like they're glued to their seat. Maybe a bit funny story, but when I started building classrooms for teachers, then the first question was always, can you build a virtual classroom? And then why would you do that? Okay. Then the second question was, can you actually make it that the avatars are glued to their seats? And like, okay, what are we doing here? We're just recreating a normal classroom in a very complicated way. But I think that's because you need to design a class differently. You need to think about it differently. And how do you do that? How do you start with a course? Do you first design the world? Do you first set the learning goals or outcomes? Or could you elaborate?
Yeah, so we look at the curriculum, and again, I kind of already have talked quite a bit about this. We sort of look for 3 or 4 conceptual entry points within the curriculum that might lend themselves to a fantastic, either a field trip or a before and after virtual experience. So once we've got that, once we've sort of selected some really good entry points based on bigger ideas or concepts within that curriculum, then you start building out the rooms. Your next question is, depending on your class, do you want them to just visit this world on their own as maybe an asynchronous assignment? So, if you think of your classroom, you can send kids to a website and they're on their own, thinking about working their way through that particular website. There might be efficacy in doing this for WebXR experiences. And so hear me out. Here's one reason maybe why, when they're first new to this, when they enter a virtual world, there's quite a bit of cognitive load that goes on in their brains because they're not used to seeing in 3D so much going around. And so when they're with more people, that actually elevates their cognitive load. They get quite excited. Then they do want to run around because it's so cool just to get in their avatar and just, go. And, so maybe their first couple experiences till they sort of shake those cobwebs out and get what we might call their virtual world legs is they have to explore the world maybe individually instead of in large groups. And they explore, and again, you give them something to do, either, number some things in the virtual world so that then they have to pay attention to these numbers, or have them solve some sort of problem where they're thinking about what they see. And then when they get out of the virtual world, they can reflect on and debrief individually first, and then maybe the whole class debriefs on what happened. Once they practice that, they'll get better then at more synchronous experiences, like a real field trip that we're used to, where everyone gets on the bus. We drive to Paris and we see the Eiffel Tower. All the kids get out. You have to settle them down first. You go over maybe some essential agreements or guidelines on sort of how that's going to happen. So you have to sort of manage that. And back to cognitive load for a second. Keep that in mind. Like, even if they're not in a VR headset, it can be overwhelming for kids. And so you really don't want to make your virtual spaces too congested. You want to spread out your 3D assets so that they're only looking and focusing on a few things. I've seen and helped coach teachers where, they populate where they spawn into the 3D environment with way too much stuff and sound right away. And that really plays on a kid's brain and cognitive load. So you want to sort of be mindful of that when they're entering these fantastic 3D experiences.
That's quite interesting point actually, because I think you're right, but I also see like a tendency because people tend to spread things around a lot, and if you're having big worlds, then the first time it's nice because you can walk around, but after a while people are just annoyed that they need to walk to another space. Like, why do I need to walk? I have a phone, I can access everything instantly, and now we're doing everything 3D and I have to walk to the exit. But maybe that's a good reason to do that, actually, as you say, just to reduce the cognitive load and keep everything clear and maybe guide them a bit through the space. Actually, quite, yeah, nice link I make now in my head, actually, for the first time. But yeah, see those two things.
I want to talk a bit about my thoughts on 3D assets too, because I think, I talked about there's some big reasons why I've hung my hat on virtual worlds, and I see more and more teachers doing this. And if we think to our classroom for a moment, maybe we're teaching a geology lesson, and we might, bring out some sort of crystal or some, metamorphic rock, as a prop, and we might pass that out to try and enhance their understanding, and that's great. We call that, a manipulative. Well, 3D immersive worlds, can do this on steroids. The library in most of these platforms use Sketchfab, and Sketchfab has an immense amount of 3D assets. And, the next step is actually allowing kids to maybe do something with those 3D assets. Again, if you think back to the classroom days for you, I don't know about me, but I got like a couple seconds looking at the metamorphic rock, and then I had to pass it on to my neighbor. And I was like, wait, I really wasn't done exploring that. Or I looked at it and I was like, I'm not sure what I meant to do here. But if we design a virtual world and we have 3D assets, allowing them to do, again, higher level cognitive activities like sort things. So you could have in your virtual world, you could have big bins or boxes with labels on them, and they have to find objects and put them or sort them into different groups or categories. So what are we doing now? We're giving them the opportunity to actively engage in a manipulative. We're making them cognitively think about the manipulative instead of like the metamorphic rock that I looked at and just passed to my neighbor. So these are also great activities. You could simplify it to the point where you could create a cube, put a vocabulary word on it, put it into the 3D space, have a whole bunch of them, and you could say, okay, I want you to put two cubes together with two words that you think belong. Or you could have a cube with a word on it, and you could have a 3D model of something, and they have to connect those two together. And again, now what are we doing? We're not just having them passively walk around the virtual world. We're actively engaging them in some sort of meaningful activity related to the content.
Yes, exactly. And these exercises, if you have your students in your Inuit world, for example, are they there alone or are they together, or does it matter if they are together, or how do you see that?
Again, it all depends on your class and the nature and the makeup of your students. Are they able to again, a space or a virtual world is only as good as the level of engagement that the kids have in it. And I've taught for 30 years, and I've had some classes where I just couldn't take them on a field trip. The behavior of a lot of the kids made it so hard that we just couldn't do it. It wouldn't be safe. The learning would be ruined. So you sort of have to gauge, do you have control over them to the point where when they enter the virtual world, they're going to do, what you want them to do. And if that's the case, then great. You could pair them up and they could, communicate with each other as a team. There's a moon-based activity on imedu that's kind of neat because it is a bit of a communication activity. They land on the moon. The scenario is that a spaceship has crashed and all these items are strewn about the moon, and kids individually first have to sort of organize this, which is most valuable that they find to keep them alive on the moon, and which is not as valuable. For example, there's a packet of matches there. Obviously those aren't as valuable, but there's like bottles of water. Obviously those are more valuable. So they land on the moon, they look at all these items, they sort them, and then they meet with a partner, and their partner might have a different sorting system. And now they have to communicate and decide, who's got the better sorting system for what's most valuable as far as these assets that have been strewn on the moon to keep us alive. And so, again, sometimes we need to think individually, and sometimes it's great to have group work.
Is it also a good way to use classic class-based methods maybe in virtual reality? Because let's say if you have to teach remotely on Zoom or Teams, it's always individual. But maybe now you can do the same things as you can do in a classroom, only with an avatar. I think I've seen some not only on our platform, but also other platforms where people are doing traditional games with A and B answer, let's say areas where you need to move, and like typical things you would do normally on a outside or in a classroom, and it gives you the same tools.
And that's a really good point about the virtual world, especially in the university and colleges, are creating digital twins of their campuses, and the efficacy behind a digital twin, from my perspective, again, this is just my humble opinion, I'm not out there to make enemies, is for this particular situation where you might have kids all over the state or province or country, and you've got a few kids maybe that are physically in the university or college, but some are attending class in a virtual lecture hall that looks just like the physical one, but from a distance. So this is in my humble opinion, a good use case of creating a copy of your classroom or a copy of your lecture hall, and then not only that, but maybe even the cafeteria, to get them sort of feeling part of the community, and feeling like they belong. So it's more a socialization perspective. If you're teaching distance learning, then these virtual spaces that look very similar to your own school are actually a good idea. But back to what we talked about before, if you're trying to deliver key content inside a virtual classroom, my question is, why do that when you can create a better, more connected environment to your curriculum? Like if you're teaching about the Aztecs, then why not take them to an environment that gives them a way better perspective on what life was like, when the Aztecs were around?
Yeah, instead of being in a virtual classroom watching a virtual slideshow with some pictures. Exactly. Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think there was also some questions. Let me see. One was a bit while ago, but is there a framework or idea used for curriculum design? That was
some of the best curriculum design out there. Are international curriculums. So I used to teach in many schools, and the organization was called the International Baccalaureate Organization, or IBO, and they have like a PYP, which is for elementary. They have an MYP framework, and then they have a DP for the high school kids. This curriculum is free to look at, and it has a lot of conceptual underpinnings that I've talked about before. It's a flexible curriculum. And so, if you're wondering more about how a more open-ended, divergent thinking curriculum might look like, have a look at the International Baccalaureate curriculums.
That sounds like a great tip. Thanks. Let me see another question. One question: if there are no headsets in the spaces, can the environment be accessed? Well, actually, I can answer that. I think we already did it, but it's also accessible on iPad. Where do you find inspirations for learning activities in 3D? Last question for now.
What a good question. I used to teach design and design thinking, and this would often be something when you try and teach problem solving. Can you give kids a real world authentic challenge? And the best way I find amazing real world connections to the curriculum is actually in the news. I consulted just last week for a company that's trying to build an interactive solar system virtual world. And so what they had was at that point just a solar system. And, I was a bit judgmental and critical, saying, there's lots of these out there. And so, when kids go into this virtual world that is a solar system, can we connect it to an authentic real world problem? And so I showed them at that time when I was talking to them, I showed them all this space junk that was happening and falling to Earth. And I said, what if you littered that solar system? Now, keep in mind, this was a high code. In other words, they were making it in something like Unity or Unreal Engine. They were going for sort of a high interactivity. They weren't making it in a no code. I said, what if you littered it with space junk all over the place? And that space junk, had gravity associated with it. And the student had to fly around in a spaceship and try and sort of collect space junk and start to notice properties of the planet based on the space junk. So now kids have a purpose. We could show them in the news all this space junk falling to Earth. So now that they see it's connected to an authentic real world problem, and they're super engaged now because they see it in the world. And how did I find that out? In the news. So I read the newspapers, I watch the news to see what's going on in the world, and could those be something we transpose to VR? And even if the interactivity isn't as high, we could still just expose them at least to that problem. Another one quickly, I know we're running out of time, was I was helping a nurse, and he was having to design a diabetes nursing experience. And so his mandate was to teach nurses about type 2 diabetes. So again, he asked for my help, and I did some research again, and I looked and found an article about how the incidence of type 2 diabetes is skyrocketed since the pandemic, and it's on the rise. So I translated that kind of like, teachers are good storytellers. So, the first thing I did was I found this Sketchfab back alley, and I had an avatar standing there with a table selling, almost like on the black market, insulin, because not only is type 2 diabetes on the rise, so is, or not on the availability of insulin has gone down. So we started out where the nursing students came into this back alley to sort of see this story playing out about people selling insulin on the black market because there wasn't very much. So we hooked the nurses into, okay, this is something I need to pay attention to, and I want to learn more about how type 2 diabetes works.
Nice, yeah. So you also use some storytelling there to really set sort of a context
yes,
for the problem and introduce it in a different way. Yeah, great. I have two questions that I want to ask you. One is actually based on a post that you made a few weeks or months ago. I don't think so. I don't remember. But you were telling that it's important to have different stages in a space, like a sort of a starting point, a middle, and an end. I think you mentioned a bit about the cognitive overload, but how could you elaborate a bit on that? Because I think it was very insightful to think about when you're placing, for example, models or components in your room, and if you choose where to start, etc.
Yeah, again, if we think about how our when we did our educational degree or our master's degree in education, I don't know about you, but one of the things that we really dived into is lesson planning and lesson design. And no different than someone making a speech. If we listen to a speech, there's a definite introduction. So as far as lesson planning goes, first step, even when you take them in a virtual world, is, what are the learning outcomes that you want your students? You could, like imedu, you could expose them to that before they go in, but I've seen people put it on like a billboard as a picture or an image while they're inside the virtual world, so they're crystal clear on their learning outcomes. Then if you can hook them with a metaphor or a story, so that's your introduction, is what are the students going to learn from this? How do we hook them into the learning, getting their attention somehow, like the diabetes story I told you? And then we're going to layer in maybe information along the way, little bits and pieces of content that maybe they'll need to solve or engage in the learning material. That might be from them exploring and finding on their own. It might be, again, using simple pictures or posters. So, the middle part of a lesson might be giving them some content that they're going to use to ruminate on. Again, this could be done outside of the virtual world, but it could be done inside. Then we're going to give them guided practice. So, it might be a procedural thing. Do they know how to order the steps to a certain experiment that they're doing in science? Do they know the procedure? We're going to expose them to that. And then kind of close to the end part, we're going to give them individual practice on something. Now do it on your own. I've helped you either with a visual guide. Now it's your turn. You're on your own somewhere in this virtual world. I want you to see if you can do it yourself. And the question that comes up that maybe someone's going to ask is, so how do we assess them? One of the things that I think is actually most valuable to assess a student in a virtual world is have them record what they're doing. No different than, if you think about in North America, we have something called American football. So not soccer like in Europe, but, NFL football. And in NFL football, and same with other sports now, they have to take an iPad after, certain plays, maybe they're on the sidelines, and they have to review their video footage of what went on there. Same idea in a virtual space. You could have a student review what they did. If you had them do a series of tasks, they could get the video footage and then they reflect on, why did you make that decision? Did you see any errors or mistakes that you made in that experience?
Yeah, and then a web-based solution is a bit more easy to record maybe than a headset solution, by the way. But yeah, I think very good exercise. Also, if you do role-playing exercises, of course, then you can also watch how the conversation went or what you did right or wrong. But there are not only students in those worlds, there's also a teacher, of course. So how do you think the role of the teacher is changing or will change over time if we start to use this kind of tools more?
Yeah, one we've already talked about, of course. As the facilitator, you want to make sure that the space is safe, and by safe I mean a number of things. Kids are engaged and they're sort of following the rules and doing what you've asked them to do, and they're not disturbing or bothering other kids. So you're a bit of a policeman, I guess, in that regard. Another is to guide them. So as they're exploring around, no different than when they're working in the classroom, you're sort of wandering around throughout that virtual space to make sure, again, what kind of qualitative observations are you noticing? Are kids looking either in groups or on their own? Are they stuck? You might help them along the way, nudge them, give them a tip or a hint. If they're a little bit misguided in what either they're trying to solve individually or through the guided practice. And then usually outside of VR, but maybe gather them at the end, no different than a field trip. If you think of the physical field trip, we gather the group of kids at the end and we just do a quick talk because, the Eiffel Tower is still in view. So if I'm done my tour of the Eiffel Tower with my kids, we're just at the base of the Eiffel Tower because it's still within sort of context and in view. You might say to them, like, what was one thing you enjoyed about that? What was one thing maybe that you didn't enjoy because it's so fresh in their memories and it's still visually, in their minds because they're in the virtual space. Whereas if as soon as you get outside of the virtual space, you might have some students that maybe because the context is now gone in a way to struggle on the debrief.
Yeah. So instead of instruction, you're more helping them understand the space and process the learnings. And I think what we also see is that teachers are actually forced to prepare their class better, which they give us as a sort of a nice experience, because they said, now I cannot cheat anymore. I just have to prepare my class because I have to build it in 3D. I cannot just free will during the instruction. And great. Let me see if there was another question from the group. Somebody loved the idea of collecting space junk, so great. Let's see if you make something from it. Please share. It will be interesting to see. I think in terms of time, we're now 40 minutes. I think we wanted to keep it at 45. So if anybody has any question, please put it in the chat right now. Otherwise, I'm going to my last ones. I think we briefly discussed it a bit, like headsets and websites and iPads. Is there a difference in when you should use it? Is it part of your design steps to decide on the device, or does it really matter? Or
there's pros and cons. Obviously, a pro to exposing kids to spaces like this inside a headset is, the world is now shut out. They can't. Their level of distraction from the physical world is minimal. Maybe a little bit of sound, but they can't. They can't be distracted by much around them. So, theoretically then, and I shouldn't say theoretically because there's some research on this, they're more engaged probably in the headset because there's less that they can see that might distract them. But they're, again, navigating the world of headsets is not always that easy, and the level of friction and onboarding to finally get them inside a headset to the site is a little bit harder. So you've got to factor that in. If you only have a 30-minute class, it's going to take longer to launch where they need to go within the headset. Whereas if you're using WebXR on the computer, that onboarding process to get to the virtual world and the learning is way faster. So again, there are pros and cons to these. What I find when I talk to teachers is that, teachers are incredibly busy people. And so they start on the computer because that's something at least that's less change for them. Change, especially in education, isn't easy. And, most of us aren't big change people. And so if you're looking at rolling it out in your school or you're hoping to evangelize within your school, you want to be mindful of how do I minimize the amount of change that happens to get the educational initiative going. And starting out on computers might be sort of the baby step that a school needs, and then once they're comfortable with that, some of your champions and your risk takers, they might move out to headsets because again the barrier of entry is a little bit higher there because there's more logistics involved and so on. So
yeah, also a very important aspect I see with teachers that they also need to feel safe, because sometimes if a teacher doesn't feel safe, they're scared to use it because they want to keep control of their class, of course, which is natural. And this is a whole new environment. They cannot use their normal tricks or way of working to manage a class. So that's also a very important step. So yeah, I think small steps is definitely a good advice here. I think there was one more question here. Any books, course of tutorials you could recommend for designing learning experiences or authors?
Yeah, one of them I mentioned already, Dr. Carl Kapp. I think it's called Learning in 3D. It was actually written, believe it or not, it was written in 2010-ish. Oh. And it applies today. And the reason it was written in 2010, for just a quick history tour, Second Life was a big 3D virtual platform back then. And he wrote it in regards to getting education up to speed on the benefits of using this 3D immersive world called Second Life. And then Second Life died out, but we see a huge resurgence of 3D virtual worlds to the point, fingers crossed that they actually stay around because they're so valuable. I see it every day. I see kids just engaged and excited to use these spaces because we're asking them to think, not just to visit.
Exactly. I think that's a good closure then also, I think, because it's still early stage, I have to say, at least that's my experience. We are busy with it, but if you look at the bigger world, for most people it's still quite new. That's also why we organize these kind of sessions. But as soon as you experience it yourself or with some students, I think you pretty quickly see the benefits or the potential of it. So thank you very much for this session. Great insights and great stories. I wrote down a few things. It's not all about facts, but more about the bigger ideas. Think about your class, both when or your situation, both when you're choosing your device or even your learning method. One thing I liked is that your experience is only as good as the level of engagement. I think there could be a very good, let's say, KPI if you're designing your spaces, that you find a way to measure that either by a questionnaire maybe, and that could really help you to see if it's effective. and not just fun or anything. I think you give some tips about the framework. Maybe if you send me the name of the frameworks that you mentioned, or I can find them back, I will put them in the comments on the recording. So a lot of different things. So thanks again, Greg. We keep in touch, and I hope everybody enjoyed the session.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. See you, everybody. Bye-bye.